In this Sicha, the discussion is going to be whether the neiros, the lamps, or the cups on top of the menorah were actually part of the menorah itself or not. The Rebbe starts off with machloikas in the Gemara regarding to the way these neiros were made. According to one opinion, the neiros, the lamps, were part of the menorah, because when the Torah says that the menorah needs to be miksha, it has to be all hammered out of one piece of gold and not be made of pieces. So this includes the neiros, the lamps as well. On the other hand, there's another opinion that says that no, that the neiros were not part of the menorah. They were set up, they were put on top of the branches of the menorah. And the way the neiros, these lamps, would actually be prepared and cleaned is that they would be removed from the menorah and they would be put down in the oil moyed. They would be wiped out and cleaned, and later, once again, they would be placed on top of the menorah. The Gemara connects this machloikas with another machloikas. The Torah says regarding the menorah, kikar zov Torah yasa oisa, the menorah needs to be made of one kikar, a weight of gold, certain weight of gold, kikar. And the Torah goes on and says, es kol ha-kelim o'elu, all of these kelim. So the question is, what about the lamps? So one opinion says that the neiros, these lamps, are part of that kikar. If they're part of that one kikar, so they are also part of that one block of gold that was hammered out into the different parts, including the lamps. There's another opinion that says, no, it's only the menorah itself that came from that one kikar of gold, but not the lamps. According to this, if that's not part of the original kikar, so then these neiros, these lamps, are also not part of the one piece of gold out of which everything was hammered out. The Rambam paskins lahalacha that the menorah, all of the menorah, comes from that one kikar of gold. The Rambam says, im neiroiseh, along with the lamps, it should all be miksha, all hammered out of that one piece of gold. And the Rambam also, so we see that it's coming from the one piece of gold, from the original kikar of gold. And the Rambam goes on and says, so here we see again that link, that according to the Rambam, shah neiros kvuin b'menorah, that the neiros are part of the menorah and part of that one original kikar. Now, the Rebbe says, we discussed many times that Rashi in his Pirush al HaTorah explains al derech hapshat. Even if it's not necessarily going to fit with the Chelek halacha in Torah, says the Rebbe, we could see this in a noticeable way in our case. As mentioned before, according to the Gemara, there's a link between these two machloikasen. The Gemara says there's a connection between the idea whether the neiros have to be out of that one block of gold, made, hammered out of that one piece of gold together with the menorah, and links it with the idea that whether it's coming from that original kikar, and to say it in the way the Ramban puts it, the Ramban says that everyone agrees that what's part of that kikar, part of that one original kikar weight of gold, is only the menorah itself and everything that's hammered out along with the menorah. In other words, everything that's part of that one block with the menorah itself. And therefore the Ramban goes on and explains that according to the opinion in what's known as the Beraisa of Melechas HaMishkan, that the Melkochayim and the Machtos, we'll translate those words in a moment, but according to the opinion that says that the Melkochayim and the Machtos are coming from that original kikar of gold, then they would also not be separate implements, separate tools or utensils of the menorah that are outside of the menorah. Rather, this opinion would hold that it's part of the menorah itself. So Melkochayim and Machtos, as we'll soon see, the traditional translation is separate implements of the menorah. But according to the Ramban, as the Ramban explains, according to this opinion, this is what the Beraisa of Melechas HaMishkan actually says, the Ramban is only explaining it, that according to this, the Melkochayim is like a little cover, a plate of gold that's covering the actual lamp itself. Machtos are like a little bowl under each one of the lamps, which the sparks fall into, but it's all part of the menorah. Because again, if it's coming from the original kikar, it's also made as part of the menorah. Then the Melkochayim and Machtos are also part of the kikar of gold. However, Rashi, what does Rashi say? On the words kikar zohav toir, Rashi says that the weight of the menorah, along with all of its kelim, have to be that kikar of gold. And earlier on, Rashi had translated. How does Rashi translate the words malkocheo machtoiseo? So Rashi translates it different the way we just said that the Ramban, quoting from this Baraisa, says. Rashi says, Malkochel are tongues, with which we take the wicks out. Machtoiseo is like a little spoon or a little cup, which we scoop out the remainder inside the lamp. So according to Rashi, these are clearly things that are separate from the menorah. These are separate utensils outside of the menorah, and yet, Rashi says, they too are part of the kikar. Again, just to summarize and to clarify. Originally, we said that it comes out from the Gemara and the Ramban, that whatever is from the kikar is also one piece with the menorah. But according to Rashi, it's not so, because he translates melkochayim and the machtois, malkochel, machtoisa, as they are separate utensils, and yet he says that they're part of that one original kikar of gold. And what's Rashi's reason? Says the Rebbe, we could explain, because the simple translation of melkochayim and machta, usually the way it appears in Tanakh, is that it's a separate implement which is being used for whatever keli we're using. For example, the Rebbe says by the Mizbeach, we have both terms, Melkochayim and Machta, in regards to the Mizbeach, and in both cases, they are something separate to the Mizbeach. And the Rebbe says, on the other hand, when the Pasuk says, Kikar Zov, Tor, Yasa, Oisa, Eskol, HaKelim, O'Ele, is that you're making the menorah along with all of the kelim that are mentioned in the Pasuk. So that would include the Melkochayim and Machtos, which again, according to Rashi, is something separate to the menorah, and yet it's coming from that one kikar of gold. So again, bottom line is, even if it's coming from the one kikar of gold, still doesn't mean it's one piece with the menorah. Based on this, says the Rebbe, according to Rashi, that this idea of miksha is not connected with the fact that it has to be part of that one block of gold. So it needs to come out that when the pasuk says neiros, and that the neiros are part of that kikar, according to Rashi, that's still not a proof that it needs to be part of that one block of gold, all as one piece. So we still don't know, according to Rashi, which way he holds. Says the Rebbe, at first glance, it would seem like Rashi does hold that when it says miksha, that it needs to be out of one block of gold, it does include the lamps. Why is that? On the words miksha teyasa menorah, Rashi explains, shelo yasen achulyos, don't make it out of different sections, and don't make the branches v'neiroisel. Rashi mentions the word neiroisel over here as different parts and then stick them all together. Rather, it all needs to be one piece, and then as you're making it, you stretch out the branches in each direction, etc. So since you're not allowed to make the neiros as separate pieces and then stuck together, it seems quite clear that the neiros do have to be made miksha, hammered out one block with the menorah. Nevertheless, the Rebbe says when we look carefully, we'll see that that's not necessarily the case. This is not necessarily a proof. Why is that? Rashi only says miksha te'asa ha'menorah means that you can make it of parts and then stick it together. In other words, the menorah cannot be welded together, stuck together of a bunch of different parts. And this is what Rashi is saying, that just like the branches cannot be made as separate parts and stuck together, the same thing is true, you can't stick the lamps onto the menorah, weld it together with the menorah, because then the menorah is not one piece. But whether the neiros, whether these lamps could be separate pieces and remain separate, in other words, we just set them up, we put them on top of the branches, as per one of the opinions of the Gemara, Rashi never discussed that. In other words, you still have the menorah itself is one piece. There's nothing stuck, nothing welded onto the menorah, and the lamps are another thing on top of the menorah. And says the Rebbe, now we can also understand why at the very ending of that Rashi, when he describes how it needs to be made from one piece, he only ends up mentioning about the kanim, how the branches are stretched out to the different directions. He doesn't mention anything about the lamps, because the lamps technically are not, according to the way we understand it now, not necessarily, it is actually part of that one block of gold, and therefore we're back to square one, that really we don't know, according to Rashi, whether it's part of the menorah or not, in the meantime. Says the Rebbe, since we don't find anything clear in Rashi, what his opinion would be about this, and he also doesn't say Eini Yodei, he doesn't say that he doesn't know, as would be in other cases where something is not clear in the Pasuk, says the Rebbe, we need to say that when we learn the simple translation and meaning of the psukim. This is so simple and so obvious that Rashi doesn't even have to explain it. It's just open and clear in the psukim itself. The explanation. When we look at the order of the parsha of how the menorah is made. So first we have the pasuk says, "V'asisa menorah zo Torah." You should make the menorah out of gold. Miksha should all be at one block hammered out. The pasuk then goes into the details. Yerecha down to the base, the branches, the cups, the knobs, the flowers. Mimeno yiyu should all be part of it. The pasuk then goes on in detail describing how all of these parts of the menorah, the branches and the cups are all made. Then the pasuk concludes, Kaftoireim ukneiseim, the knobs, the branches, mimeno yiyu should all be part of it. Miksha achazov Torah should all be of one piece of gold hammered out. Note, there was no mention yet of the lamps, the neiros. Only after this does the pasuk say, V'asisas neiroiseo shiva, you should make 7 neiros. And then it also speaks about umalkocheo machtoiseo, which again, according to Rashi, would mean the tongues and the scoops would all be made kikar zov toir. It's all coming from this one kikar of gold. Says the Rebbe in Parshas Vayakil, where this is all being related again of how it actually practically happens. We again see all the same ideas, all these same details in the same order. So says the Rebbe, from the fact that V'yossi are making these lamps, say only after all of the details of making the actual body of the menorah itself, after the pasuk had said, concluding that section, that it should all be of one piece of gold, only then does it speak about the lamps. So it's understood that according to Pshutei Shel Mikra, which is Rashi's way, ala Torah, these neiroisel, these lamps are in fact separate cups that are not part of the body of the menorah. Rather, they are more in the category of the next things the Torah is going to tell us about malkochel, umachtoisel, these different tongues and scoops, which is all being said right after neiroisel. In other words, these are not part of the menorah itself. Another proof, says the Rebbe, in Parshas Pekudei, the Torah tells us how the Mishkan is being brought to Moshe. So the pasuk elaborates, Es ha-menorah ha-tohira, the menorah is brought, Es neiroisel, the lamps are brought. So the Rebbe says, if the lamps are separate to the menorah, as we've been explaining, so then we can understand why the Torah is telling us 2 separate things. The menorah is brought and the lamps are brought. But if the neiros of the lamps are one piece with the menorah, then what would it mean that the menorah is brought and the lamps are brought? When you bring the menorah, automatically the lamps, the neiros are there as well. Just like the Torah won't tell us that the menorah is brought and the branches and the cups. Again, so all of this tells us that according to Rashi, in the simple reading of the psukim, the neiros are something separate. Says the Rebbe, based on this, that this would be Rashi's way in Torah, that the neiros are not part of miksha, part of that one block of gold, we're now also going to understand the number of changes in Rashi compared to the way Rashi translates over here about neiros to the way he explains it in Parshas Vayakil, and some other questions that also come up in the Rashi over there, where the Torah is repeating in Parshas Vayakil about Melechas HaMishkan. And the Rebbe says, on the pasuk Ves Menorahs Hamor, that regarding the menorah, Ves Kelea, Ves Neiroiseh. So the pasuk, so Rashi over there, on the word Neiroiseh, explains, and he brings a French word, he says Lutzinish Belaz. In Old French it would be called Lutzinish. And then Rashi goes ahead and explains what it means. These are bozichim, these are cups or bowls in which you have the oil and the wicks. And the Rebbe asks, seemingly, Rashi had explained all of this already. In our parsha on the word Esneiroisel, where the menorah is being mentioned for the first time, Rashi told us the same idea. Kemin bozichim, it's like little bowls in which you put in the oil and the wicks. So since Rashi had explained this already in our parsha, what neiros are, why is Rashi repeating this again in Parshas Vayakil? The Rebbe says the question is even more. Rashi himself tells us in Parshas Vayakil, a few psukim before this one, Rashi says, I explained already all of the donations of the Mishkan and the work of the Mishkan, where they were originally commanded. And this is why Rashi is not explaining most things of the Nedavis and Melechas HaMishkan again, unless there's some new novelty over here which wasn't said in the original place. So why in our case, so since Rashi is usually relying on what he explained already, the question becomes, then why in our case, when it comes to the neiros, which he had explained already what they are, why is he repeating it in Parshas Vayakil? And finally, the Rebbe says, what's this business with this French word that Rashi is introducing this whole thing with? Lutzinish Belaz. Seemingly, Either way you look at it, there's a problem. If the meaning of bezichin, that it's like a little bowl in which you have the oil and the wicks, is sufficient, and if it's not sufficient, and we also need to have the French word, then Rashi should have told us thus the first time around when neiros are mentioned for the first time in Parshas Terumah, in our Parsha. If, on the other hand, we don't need this French word, because by the fact that you're translating it as little cups or little bowls in which you have the oils in the wick, then why does he need to add it in Parshas Vayakel? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this based on another diuk in Rashi. But first, says the Rebbe, by prefacing that we discussed already a number of times, that every single word and letter in Rashi is absolutely precise, absolutely accurate. And that is not only in regards to the words of Rashi's actual explanation, but even in his Dibra Maschala, he quotes the words of the Pasuk. Says the Rebbe, one of the places where we could see this in a very obvious way, how accurate, precise, and Dibra Maschal of Rashi is in this Rashi that we just quoted from Parshas Vayakel. So in this Pasuk, the Pasuk says, Ves menoiras hamoir, Ves keileha, Ves neiroiseh, Ves shemen hamoir. In Rashi, we have three Dibra Maschals. Number one on Ves keileha, Rashi says this refers to the melkochayim and to the machtos, to the tongues and to the scoops. Next Rashi, neiroiseh, is what we quoted before. He says lutzinish, he says old French word lutzinish, and he explains about how it's these bowls that hold the oil in the wicks. Number three, veis shemen hamoir, Rashi says this also needs special craftsmen to be able to make it. Says Rebbe, we notice something very interesting over here, a very, very obvious difference in these three Dibra Maschals. In the first and third Dibra Maschal, Rashi also quotes the word ve'es, on the word ve'es keileha and the word ve'es shemen hamoir. But when it comes to neiroiseh, Rashi only says the word neiroiseh, he doesn't say the word ve'es. But based on what we explained, that the neiros are again not part of the miksha, not part of that one block of gold that the menorah is made of, we can now understand all of these questions. And the Rebbe explains, since according to Rashi, neiros are not part of the menorah, so then when the Pasuk said, in our Parsha, when the Pasuk says that it needs to be made one kikar, and Yase Oise, you should make the menorah out of one kikar of gold, and Eskol HaKelim O'elu, you're making all of the kelim of the menorah with that one kikar. So the neiros, when it speaks about you make the menorah and the kelim, so which one are the neiros part of? We just explained that the neiros, the lamps, are not part of the menorah. So rather it's part of Eskol HaKelim O'elu, part of the vessels of the menorah. So that's the way we would understand it based on Parshas Terumah. So now comes the problem. We read the pasuk just quoted before from Parshas Vayakel. And the pasuk reads again, Ve'es menoiras hamor, Ve'es keileha, Ve'es neiroiseh. So what happened over here? Isn't neiros part of the kelim? Didn't we just establish that? So since it says already Ve'es keileha, which includes the neiros, why is the pasuk saying now neiroiseh separately? It's in order to answer this question that we have these Rashis, where Rashi is explaining again the concept of neiros and giving us the French word. Says the Rebbe, in order to answer this, so Rashi first goes on the words ve'es keileha. And he explains ve'es keileha, what is that specifically referring to in Parshas Vayakel? To melkochayim and the machtos, to the tongues and to those scoops. Now we just said before that neiros are technically also part of the kelim. So this is what Rashi continues. Rashi immediately quotes the next word of the pasuk, neiroiseh, skipping the word ve'es neiroiseh, with the intention to emphasize the point that we need to be reading this pasuk as if it said es keileha and neiroiseh without the ve'es, because it's as if the pasuk itself is telling you one of the kelim. Es keileha, which kelim? The neiros. In other words, that's a detail in the kelim. Keileha specifically would be referring to an our pasuk, as Rashi says, and that's why Rashi says it first, melkochayim and maktois. And then the pasuk is telling us one of the other kelim clearly, and that is neiroiseh. But then the obvious question, if you said keileha already, why would you be saying neiroiseh separately? If it's already part of the kelim. And this is what Rashi is coming by saying the word lutzinish balaz. What's the root of this word lutzinish in French? It means light. And so, in other words, why are the neiros called by this name? Why are the neiros being called by a word? And lamps, why are lamps called with this French word? Because of light. So as Rashi goes on, because that's the purpose of these lamps. These are cups in which you have the oil and the wick. In other words, since they represent the whole point of the menorah itself, which is about bringing light, and that happens by you have the oil and the wicks inside of them, so that's why the word for it is really a word that represents light. In other words, neiros, so now what's the conclusion of all of this? What is a lamp? The lamp is all about light. That's what Rashi is really trying to tell us. Once we understand that the lamp part of it, that's the idea of light. So since the whole purpose of the menorah is light, is the neir, so now we can understand why the Torah would specify it separately by saying eskeleh, and then saying separately the word neir, even though it's one of the kelim, but trying to emphasize that neir is something unique and different, because this is the whole purpose of the menorah.